Let me take you back to the day I discovered something that would change my life forever. It was early morning, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the water, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. My private island, a place I had always thought of as my own little corner of paradise, looked peaceful, almost magical. The salty breeze carried the scent of the ocean, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil and pine trees. Everything felt right with the world. I had been away for a couple of weeks visiting family in Boston, and returning to the island felt like coming home after a long journey. As my boat approached the shore, I could already picture myself sitting on the porch of my cabin, sipping coffee while listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the rocks. But as I stepped onto the sandy beach, something felt off. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Then I turned toward the clearing where wildflowers used to grow freely, and my heart sank. There, covering nearly half of my beloved island, were rows upon rows of shiny solar panels. They stretched out like an army of metallic soldiers, glinting harshly under the sunlight. Their unnatural geometry clashed violently with the natural curves of the land. What once had been untouched wilderness now looked industrial, cold, and foreign. It was as if someone had taken a knife to the soul of the island and left it bleeding. My stomach churned as I walked closer, trying to process what I was seeing. How could this happen? Who gave them permission to do this? And why here, of all places? A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I realized the truth. No one had asked me. No one had even told me they were planning this. This wasn't just some minor inconvenience. It was a blatant disregard for my rights, my property, and my peace. On the ground near the edge of the panel field, I spotted a folded piece of paper weighed down by a stone. Picking it up, I unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a letter from the Homeowners Association, the HOA. In formal language that somehow managed to feel both condescending and impersonal, they explained that these 172 solar panels were part of a regional initiative aimed at promoting renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions. They went on to say that because my island fell within their jurisdiction, they had the authority to proceed without needing my explicit approval. Jurisdiction, authority. Those words hit me like punches. This was my asterisk island. I paid taxes on it, maintained it, and cherished it more than anything else in the world. Yet somehow, according to them, it belonged to everyone but me. The audacity of it made my blood boil. As I stood there staring at the panels, I couldn't help but think about how much work I'd put into preserving this place. Over the years, I'd cleared trails, planted native flowers, and nurtured the ecosystem so it could thrive. Now, all of that effort seemed meaningless. These panels didn't just block sunlight. They blocked memories, dreams, and everything that made this island special to me. But anger wasn't the only emotion swirling inside me. There was also fear. Fear of what might come next. If they could do this, what else could they take away? The first thing I did after finding that letter was try to talk to the people responsible. It seemed like the logical step, right? If someone does something wrong, you confront them and explain why it's unfair. So I picked up my phone and dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Carl speaking," he said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Hi, Carl," I began, trying to sound calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "This is Claire Harper. I own the island where you've installed those solar panels." There was a pause before he responded. Yes, Ms. Harper. I assume you're calling about the recent developments." "Developments," I repeated, incredulous. "You mean illegally installing 172 solar panels on private property without asking for permission?" His voice hardened instantly. "Let's not get dramatic here. Your island falls under our jurisdiction, as clearly stated in the letter. This project has been approved by local authorities and is part of a larger initiative to promote renewable energy. You should be proud to contribute." "Proud?" I snapped, no longer able to keep the frustration out of my voice. You're trespassing on my land, ruining its natural beauty, and calling it progress. Do you have any idea what this place means to me?" He sighed, as if dealing with an unreasonable child. "Look, Ms. Harper, we understand your concerns, but sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. These panels will reduce carbon emissions significantly. Surely you can see the benefit." I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to scream. Greater good? What about my asterisk good? What about respecting boundaries and personal property? Did it ever occur to you to ask me first instead of just barging in and taking over? He ignored my question entirely. "The panels are already installed. Removing them now would be wasteful and counterproductive. I suggest you accept the situation and move forward." "Accept it?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You're telling me to roll over and let you destroy my home because it suits your agenda? That's not going to happen." By the end of the call, I was shaking, not from fear, but from sheer anger. Carl's dismissive attitude had only fueled my determination. Talking to him wasn't going to solve anything. He wasn't interested in compromise or fairness. All he cared about was maintaining control. And if that was how he wanted to play, then fine. I'd find another way to fight back. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my mind. The HOA thought they could steamroll over me, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. I wasn't some pushover who would quietly bow to their demands. This island was my sanctuary, my refuge, a place where I could escape the chaos of the world. They weren't going to take that away from me without a fight. As dawn broke through the window, casting soft light across the room, an idea began to form. It started small, almost like a whisper in the back of my mind, but it grew louder the more I thought about it. If the HOA valued sunlight so much, maybe it was time to give them a taste of darkness. The next day, I drove into town and visited the local nursery. Rows of saplings lined the shelves. Maple trees, oak trees, pine trees, and even some fruit-bearing varieties. The owner, a kindly older man named Mr. Thompson, greeted me warmly. "What can I help you with today?" he asked, wiping dirt from his hands onto his jeans. "I need trees," I said firmly. "Lots of them." Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "How many are we talking?" "As many as you've got," I replied, pulling out my wallet. "And make sure they're fast-growing ones." He chuckled, clearly amused by my enthusiasm. "Planning to start your own forest?" "Something like that," I muttered under my breath. By the time I loaded the last sapling onto my boat, I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of rebellion burning deep within me. Each tree represented a chance to reclaim what had been taken. Together, they would become my army, standing tall against the metallic invasion. On the ride back to the island, I couldn't stop smiling. Sure, planting hundreds of trees wouldn't solve everything overnight, but it was a start. For the first time since discovering those panels, I felt like I had a plan, a way to fight back without resort. The days that followed were filled with dirt under my nails, blisters on my hands, and a stubborn determination that refused to fade. Planting trees might sound simple. Dig a hole, drop in a sapling, cover it with soil. But when you're doing it hundreds of times, it becomes anything but easy. Still, every time I plunged the shovel into the earth, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just gardening. This was resistance. I started early each morning, before the sun climbed too high in the sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and salt water. With a bucket of water slung over one shoulder and a bag of tools hanging from the other, I worked methodically, planting row after row of saplings around the edges of the solar panel field. Each tree was carefully spaced apart, giving them room to grow strong roots and spread their branches wide. By midday, sweat soaked through my shirt, and my muscles ached, but I didn't stop, not once. As the weeks went by, word of what I was doing began to spread. Neighbors passing by in their boats slowed down to stare, some shaking their heads disapprovingly while others gave me curious waves. One afternoon, as I was watering a fresh batch of saplings, I noticed a small crowd gathering near the shore. Among them was Mrs. Anderson, an elderly woman who lived on the mainland but often visited her son's house nearby. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" she called out, shielding her eyes from the sun with one hand. "Blocking sunlight," I replied without missing a beat, pouring another stream of water onto the ground. "If they want panels, they'll have to deal with shade." A few people laughed nervously, unsure whether to admire my boldness or pity my apparent futility. But there were also nods of approval, quiet signs that not everyone agreed with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. A young couple even brought me lemonade one afternoon, thanking me for standing up to those bullies. Their support meant more than they realized, fueling my resolve even further. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Carl showed up unannounced one day, striding onto the island like he owned the place. His polished shoes sank slightly into the soft sand, and his pressed suit looked wildly out of place among the wild greenery. He stopped a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, glaring at the newly planted saplings. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded, gesturing toward the trees. "You think these little sticks are going to make a difference?" I straightened up, brushing dirt off my hands. "They will if given enough time. Trees grow, Carl. Unlike your shiny panels, which are already losing efficiency thanks to the shade." His jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous. These won't mature fast enough to impact the panels significantly." "Maybe not tomorrow," I shot back, planting my hands on my hips. "But give it a year or two, and we'll see how well your precious project performs then." Carl opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he turned on his heel and marched back to his boat, muttering something about wasting resources. Watching him leave, I couldn't help but smile. For all his arrogance, he hadn't counted on one thing: patience. I had time on my side, and I was willing to wait however long it took to win this fight. Despite Carl's skepticism, the trees continued to thrive. Every morning, I checked on them, marveling at how quickly they adapted to their new home. Tiny buds appeared on the branches, and delicate leaves unfurled, reaching toward the sky. Even the wildlife seemed to approve. The squirrels darted between trunks, and birds nested in the uppermost boughs, filling the air with cheerful chirps. But the battle wasn't just physical, it was mental too. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering insidious thoughts. What if Carl was right? What if the trees didn't grow fast enough? What if I was wasting my time and energy on a hopeless cause? On those days, I reminded myself why I was doing this. This wasn't just about blocking sunlight. It was about reclaiming control. About proving that nature could heal itself, if only we gave it a chance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, I sat beneath one of the tallest saplings. Its slender trunk swayed gently in the breeze, casting a faint shadow across the ground. Someday that shadow would stretch far and wide, swallowing the harsh glare of the solar panels whole. And when that day came, I knew I'd be ready. For now, though, I focused on the present, one tree at a time, one day at a time. Because sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can lead to the biggest victories. Months passed, and the trees began to transform. What had once been fragile saplings now stood taller, their branches stretching skyward as if determined to reclaim the space stolen by the solar panels. The island itself seemed alive again, humming with a vitality that had been absent since the metallic invasion. Birds nested in the growing canopy, squirrels darted between trunks, and wildflowers sprouted in the shade beneath the leaves. It was as though nature was fighting back alongside me, healing the wounds inflicted by the HOA's intrusion. But while my forest grew stronger, the HOA wasn't about to give up without a fight. I noticed maintenance crews arriving more frequently, armed with pruning shears and chainsaws. Their mission was clear: cut back any tree limbs that dared encroach on the solar panel's precious access to sunlight. Each time they came, I watched from a distance, my fists clenched and my jaw tight. They hacked away at the lower branches, leaving piles of green debris scattered across the ground. But no matter how much they trimmed, the trees always bounced back. New shoots sprouted where old ones had been severed, defiant and resilient. It became a game of attrition, a relentless back-and-forth battle between growth and destruction. Every time they pruned, I replanted. Every time they cut, I nurtured. The HOA thought they could outlast me, but they underestimated two things: the tenacity of nature and my refusal to quit. Despite the progress, the strain of the fight weighed heavily on me. My days were long and exhausting, filled with digging, watering, and tending to the trees. At night, I collapsed onto my porch chair, staring at the stars through the canopy above. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. My mind raced with worries about the future. Would the trees grow fast enough? Could I keep up this pace indefinitely? And what would happen if I lost? Friends and neighbors tried to convince me to let it go. "Claire," one of them said during a rare visit, "you're fighting an uphill battle. Why not just accept it and move on?" I shook my head, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with my finger. Because this isn't just about solar panels or trees. It's about standing up for what's right. If I give up now, what message does that send? That they can do whatever they want, whenever they want, without consequences. The visitor sighed, clearly unconvinced, but didn't press further. Deep down, I knew they meant well, but they couldn't understand what this island meant to me. To them, it might have been a piece of land, a financial asset, or a weekend getaway. To me, it was home, a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe freely and feel connected to something bigger than myself. Letting the HOA win would mean losing a part of who I was. As winter approached, the air grew colder and the days shorter. The trees shed their leaves, standing bare against the gray skies. For the first time, doubt crept into my heart. Without their lush foliage, would they still be able to block the sunlight? Was all my effort for nothing? Then, one frosty morning, I found a small miracle waiting for me. Beneath the skeletal branches of the oaks and maples, tiny buds had already begun to form, promises of spring yet to come. Even in dormancy, the trees were preparing to rise again. They weren't defeated. They were simply resting, gathering strength for the next phase of growth. Watching them, I realized something important. Resilience isn't about never faltering. It's about finding the courage to keep going, even when the odds seem impossible. That same week, I received another letter from the HOA. This one wasn't addressed to me directly, but rather slipped into my mailbox anonymously. Inside was a printout of data showing the declining efficiency of the solar panels. Apparently, thanks to my efforts, energy production had dropped by nearly 30% since the trees had taken root. Someone within the organization wanted me to know. They wanted me to see that my actions were working. Holding the paper in my hands, I felt a surge of hope. The HOA's polished facade was beginning to crack. Their grand green initiative was faltering, undermined not by violence or anger, but by patience and perseverance. One day, those cracks would widen into chasms, and the entire structure would crumble under its own weight. Until then, I kept planting, kept nurturing, kept believing. Because sometimes, the quietest revolutions are the most powerful. And mine was just getting started. As winter gave way to spring, the island came alive in ways I hadn't seen since before the solar panels arrived. The trees, now taller and fuller, burst into vibrant greenery, their leaves soaking up sunlight while simultaneously casting long shadows over the metallic expanse below. It was a quiet kind of revenge, nature reclaiming its own without raising a fist or uttering a word. And it was working. The HOA's frustration became increasingly evident. Maintenance crews visited more often, their tools clanging loudly against the silence of the forest. They hacked away at branches, trimmed back foliage, and even tried to dig up some of the younger saplings near the edges of the panel field. But no matter how hard they worked, they couldn't keep up. For every branch they cut, two more seemed to grow in its place. The trees were relentless, just like me. What surprised me most, though, was the growing support from the community. At first, people had been hesitant, unsure whether to cheer me on or side with the HOA's authority. But as news of the declining efficiency of the solar panels spread, opinions began to shift. Neighbors who once shook their heads in disapproval now stopped by to offer encouragement or even lend a hand. One weekend, a group of locals showed up unannounced, armed with shovels and seedlings. Together, we planted dozens more trees, expanding the forest farther than I'd ever imagined possible. "You're not alone in this," said Mrs. Anderson, the elderly woman who had questioned me months earlier. She handed me a thermos of hot tea as we took a break under the shade of an oak tree. "We've all seen how the HOA operates. They think they're untouchable, but you're proving them wrong." Her words stayed with me long after she left. For so long, I'd felt isolated in this fight, like I was standing on one side of a chasm while everyone else stood on the other. But now, I realize I wasn't alone. There were others who believed in fairness, in justice, and in the power of nature to heal itself. The turning point came when someone leaked internal documents from the HOA to a local newspaper. The expose revealed that the organization had falsified permits and bypassed legal requirements to install the solar panels on my island. Worse still, the so-called regional initiative was less about reducing carbon emissions and more about lining their pockets through government subsidies for renewable energy projects. The article sparked outrage, both within our small community and beyond. People were furious, not just at the HOA's actions, but at their hypocrisy. Carl, predictably, went on the defensive. He called an emergency town hall meeting, insisting that the allegations were exaggerated and accusing me of orchestrating a smear campaign. When he stepped up to the podium that evening, his usual confidence was noticeably absent. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled through his notes. "This is ridiculous," he began, his voice strained. "Ms. Harper has twisted facts and misled the public. We're trying to save the environment here, not destroy it." Before he could continue, the room erupted into chaos. Voices shouted over one another, demanding answers and accountability. Someone held up a photo of my island, showing the stark contrast between the natural beauty of the trees and the sterile rows of solar panels. Another person waved a copy of the leaked documents, pointing out the forged signatures and missing approvals. When the noise finally died down, I stood up. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to speak clearly, holding up pictures of the island before and after the panel's installation. "This isn't about saving the environment," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "It's about control. About taking what isn't yours and calling it progress. But look at what you've done." I gestured toward the images. "You destroyed ecosystems, violated property rights, and lied to justify your greed. And for what? Panels that are barely functional because of the very nature you claim to protect." The crowd erupted again, this time in agreement. Carl looked around, his face reddening as he realized he'd lost control of the narrative. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. He knew the tide was turning, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. That night, as I walked home under a sky filled with stars, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in months. The cracks in the HOA's armor were widening, and the weight of public opinion was pressing down on them. This fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, victory felt within reach. And I knew, deep down, that no matter what happened next, I'd already won something far greater: the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. The momentum was unstoppable now. The town hall meeting had ignited a firestorm, and the HOA's carefully constructed image began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Local newspapers ran follow-up stories, investigative journalists dug deeper, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #SaveHarperIsland and #NatureOverGreed. People who had never set foot on my island were sharing photos of the trees, calling them symbols of resistance against corporate overreach. Carl tried to fight back, issuing statements that sounded more desperate than convincing. "Ms. Harper is misrepresenting the facts," he said in one interview, his voice strained as he dodged questions about the forged permits. "This project was approved through proper channels, and we stand by our commitment to renewable energy." But no one was buying it anymore. Not after the evidence piled up. Emails showing falsified documents, internal memos revealing profit motives disguised as environmentalism, and testimonials from former HOA employees who confirmed the corruption behind closed doors. Even some of Carl's own board members distanced themselves, fearing backlash from an increasingly vocal public. Meanwhile, my forest continued to thrive. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that cast long, dappled shadows across the solar panels. Energy production plummeted further, leaving the panels all but useless. Maintenance crews still came occasionally, but their efforts felt futile now, like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. They'd trim a few branches here and there, only for new growth to surge forward within weeks. Nature wasn't just resisting, it was winning. One morning, I woke up to find a letter slipped under my cabin door. It was from the Regional Environmental Agency, the same group that had initially endorsed the HOA's solar panel project. In formal yet measured language, they announced they were launching an investigation into the legality of the installation. Until the matter was resolved, all maintenance activities on my island were suspended. I read the letter 3 times, my hands trembling slightly. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. The HOA's power was slipping away, piece by piece, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. That afternoon, I took a walk through the forest, marveling at how much it had transformed since those first saplings. Birds chirped overhead, squirrels darted between trunks, and wildflowers bloomed in the shade beneath the leaves. The air smelled fresh and alive, filled with the earthy scent of soil and bark. It was hard to believe this place had once been dominated by cold, lifeless metal. As I stood there, listening to the rustle of leaves in the breeze, I thought about everything that had led me here. The sleepless nights, the blisters on my hands, the moments of doubt when I wondered if I was fighting a losing battle. But most of all, I thought about the people who had stood by me. The neighbors who brought seedlings, the strangers who shared my story online, and even Mrs. Anderson, who had become a kind of cheerleader for the cause. A week later, the final blow came. Under mounting pressure from the public, the environmental agency, and legal threats from attorneys eager to represent me pro bono, the HOA issued a statement announcing they would dismantle the solar panels. After careful consideration, the press release read, "We have decided to prioritize community harmony and environmental integrity." Translation: they'd lost, and everyone knew it. When the crew arrived to remove the panels, I didn't gloat or celebrate. I simply watched from a distance, leaning against the trunk of a young oak tree. One by one, the panels were disassembled and loaded onto trucks, leaving behind scars on the land that would take time to heal. But scars fade, and so would these. The trees would grow taller, the soil would recover, and the island would return to its natural state. As the last truck rumbled off the shore, I walked to the edge of the clearing where the panels had once stood. The sun filtered gently through the leaves above, casting golden light onto the ground below. For the first time in months, I felt peace, not just in my surroundings, but within myself. This fight had changed me. It had taught me that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And as I looked out over the forest I'd helped create, I realized something else. Sometimes, the smallest acts of defiance, a single planted seed, a whispered refusal to give up, can spark movements far greater than we ever imagined. The weeks that followed the removal of the solar panels felt like a dream. My island, once marred by rows of metallic panels and the scars they left behind, began to heal in ways I hadn't anticipated. The trees, no longer overshadowed or hacked by maintenance crews, grew with an almost defiant vigor. Their roots spread deep into the soil, stabilizing the land that had been disturbed during the installation. Wild grasses sprouted where the panels once stood, and soon clusters of wildflowers, poppies, daisies, and lupines, began to bloom, painting the ground in bursts of color. Every morning, I'd walk through the forest, marveling at how alive it felt. Birds sang louder, their melodies weaving together in a symphony of renewal. Squirrels darted between branches, their bushy tails flicking as they gathered acorns. Even the butterflies returned, fluttering lazily in the golden sunlight that filtered through the canopy. It was as if the island itself was celebrating its freedom. But this wasn't just about nature reclaiming its space. It was about me reclaiming mine. For months, I'd been consumed by anger, frustration, and fear. I'd fought not just for my island, but for something deeper, a sense of autonomy, a belief that fairness matters, and a reminder that progress shouldn't come at the cost of what's sacred. Now, standing amidst the thriving forest, I realized I'd gained something far greater than victory. I'd found clarity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I sat on the porch of my cabin with a cup of tea in hand. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and salt water. I thought about everything that had happened, the battles won, the lessons learned, and the people who had supported me along the way. This fight had shown me the power of resilience, both in nature and in myself. It had also reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten: the importance of community. Mrs. Anderson stopped by later that week, bringing a basket of fresh bread and homemade jam. "I just wanted to see how you're doing," she said, settling onto the porch chair beside me. "You've done something remarkable here, Claire." I smiled, gesturing toward the trees. "We did it, not just me. Without everyone planting, sharing stories, or speaking out, none of this would have been possible." She nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you were the spark. You refused to back down when most would have given up. That takes courage." Her words stayed with me long after she left. Courage. I hadn't thought of myself as courageous before. All I'd done was stand up for what I believed in. But maybe that's exactly what courage is, choosing to fight for what's right, even when the odds feel impossible. As summer approached, life on the island settled into a rhythm of peace and restoration. The scars from the solar panels faded beneath layers of new growth, and the ecosystem thrived in ways it hadn't in years. Deer wandered through the underbrush, and fish returned to the streams that flowed into the ocean. Every day brought another sign that the island was healing. And so was I. One afternoon, while tending to some newly planted saplings near the shore, I noticed a group of kayakers paddling close to the island. They waved enthusiastically, pointing toward the dense forest. "Your trees are beautiful," one of them called out. They inspired us to start planting more back home. Their words filled me with pride. What had begun as a personal fight had grown into something bigger, a movement, however small, toward respecting nature and standing up against greed. These trees weren't just blocking sunlight anymore. They were symbols of hope, resilience, and unity. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the gentle hum of crickets outside, I reflected on how much had changed, not just on the island, but within me. I used to think of this place as a refuge, a quiet escape from the chaos of the world. And while it still was, it had become something more. A reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we can make a difference. Sometimes, all it takes is planting a single seed and believing it will grow. The shadows cast by the trees now felt comforting, a testament to the power of patience and persistence. They whispered stories of resistance, of roots digging deep and branches reaching high. And as I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sound of waves lapping against the shore, I knew one thing for certain. This island wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside me. Together, we had turned darkness into light.